Good evening. My name is Alan Detloff, and I'm very honored to serve as Dean of the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston. And today, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to the 6th annual Maconda Brown O'Connor Distinguished Lecture, Speaking of Social Justice, featuring Marlon Peterson, author of Bird Uncaged and Abolitionist's Freedom Song, this year's selection for our Social Justice Summer Reading Program. One of my favorite things to do every year is to select the book for this program that we invite all of our GCSW community to read, including our faculty, staff, and alumni. The books that I choose for this series reflect our commitment to racial justice and our commitment to fighting against racism and white supremacy. Throughout this past year, many important conversations have occurred about the problem of racism, violence, and outright execution of Black Americans by our current system of policing. But police violence is just one of the problems associated with the criminal punishment system and the prison industrial complex. Mass criminalization and over-surveillance that disproportionately and intentionally targets Black and Brown people destroys families, separates parents from children, it ruins people's abilities to earn income, and we know it does nothing to deter crime. We're also at a unique moment in our profession of social work. Last summer, following the murders of George Floyd and many others in the early months of 2020, each at the hands of law enforcement, many conversations occurred about the role of social work in policing and the potential for social work to replace police in some situations as a means of reducing the racist violence that results from policing. Those conversations led to many of us in the profession acknowledging that replacing the police with social workers isn't a solution to anything, because replacing the police with social workers doesn't mean we won't continue to see racist outcomes. Social work has its very own complicated history with racism that is deeply ingrained in the origins of our profession. And to this day, we continue to see racism and racist outcomes in many of the systems where we as social workers practice. And this is because, with few exceptions, social work as a profession has not done a very good job of acknowledging the racism that exists in our profession, not only in our history, but in our present. To this day, social work as a profession continues to debate whether we should collaborate with the police, whether we should work in jails and prisons, whether we should be part of crisis response teams where social workers walk hand in hand into communities with the police, the very people who are responsible for murdering and terrorizing them. But many of us are advocating for something different and confronting our field with important questions. Can we continue to be complicit in the harm and inequities that result from these systems? Can we continue to support a carceral state that disproportionately surveils, polices, and punishes Black and Brown Americans with sometimes fatal consequences? Or can we begin to envision a society that works differently, that responds to social problems without the need for surveillance, punishment, and incarceration? Today's event is a continuation of a series of conversations we began last year, in which we've explored abolition as a vision, abolition as practice, and abolition as a critical framework to bring about change, and specifically as a framework to address the racist violence, racist inequities, and the racist outcomes we see in our carceral systems. This year's summer reading selection builds on those conversations as we continued our pursuit of liberation with Bird Uncaged, an abolitionist freedom song by Marlon Peterson. I selected Bird Uncaged because it's not only a beautiful memoir, it is an exploration of all that we can be as a society if we were free from the cages that confine us. Marlon Peterson, our guest tonight, is the principal of the Presidential Group, a social justice consulting firm. He's host of the Decarcerated podcast, a senior Atlantic Fellow for Racial Equity, a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network, and a 2015 recipient of the Soros Justice Fellowship. Ebony Magazine has named him one of America's 100 most influential and inspiring leaders in the Black community. His TED Talk, Am I Not Human? A Call for Criminal Justice Reform, has been viewed over 1.2 million times. His writing has appeared in Ebony, The Nation, USA Today, Color Lines, and more. A graduate of New York University, he lives in Brooklyn and plays the steel pan during the summer. I'm also going to introduce our moderator for tonight's Q&A session with our audience, Dr. Charles Lee. Dr. Lee joined the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work in July 2019 as an assistant professor. His research and scholarship investigates the intersectionality of race, class, and gender in educational, correctional, and neighborhood contexts, and the impact these issues have on the health and well-being of young Black men and boys at risk and involved in the juvenile and criminal punishment systems. And before we welcome our speaker for tonight, we have a short introductory video that will play now.
This is is dated February 18, 2005. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was, before you went to jail, what were you thinking about? What were some of your emotions when you went to court or when they first put cuffs on you? No lie, it was plenty of times I could have gotten taken to the precinct or gotten arrested just because of the friends I hanged out with. A lot of people, parents, teachers, even kids told me to stay away from these friends, but it's just hard because the activity they do just encourage you to do the same. Anyway, nice writing to you. Hope you stay a peaceful gentleman. Hope you write back again. Keep your head up. So this is BCM. BCM Park is what we used to call it growing up. It's now called Broward Park. That's a proper name, but growing up, we used to call it BCM. We used to play ball here, do a lot of other stuff here. This is where I taught my nephew how to play ball. This is where I learned how to play ball, literally on this court. It's interesting. So the 80s and 90s in Crown Heights is like a lot of ghettos in the city, in the country. There's a lot more murders, and crack was king. My older brother and sister would definitely tell you that I was a nerdy, geeky kid. The nerdy persona and all that stuff didn't work for me. So eventually, because of some other things that happened when I was like a little bit older, around 14, I just sort of made a conscious decision to like shift. One was like I was jumped badly, like really beaten. Somebody tried to rob me in school, in Weston House downtown, and it got really bad. I was out of school for a little bit. And then like even in recovery of it, I was almost raped at gunpoint by a person in Manhattan, literally. And I had, I'm telling you about this now, and this is not something I was comfortable telling people, not until maybe 3-4 years ago when I first felt comfortable even telling people about that. Those two things like stuck with me a lot, and it bothered me a lot, and it walked with me as I walked every day. And I was like, literally like, this ain't gonna happen to me anymore. So things shifted. It didn't happen overnight, but like a lot of activities that I knew not to engage in, things I knew that were probably problematic and troublesome, people to be around, I started like slowly like getting in there and becoming that and involving myself with it. You wanna hold the door? This elevator is where I was shot. There's 3 of us in here, and a homeboy of mine had a gun and he pulled it out and he was just like trying to, like, he was just messing with it. And I guess it went off, and I was standing right here, and the gun went off, and it went off, and I felt the pain in my foot, but I didn't know. But I know my homeboys behind me. I sort of like fell back a little bit, and then I didn't see anything. I didn't see no blood or nothing, but I knew I felt like it was burning, like somebody had like a lighter. It was on my foot, and I knew, and I realized there was a hole in my bottom of my sneaker. So the bullet actually hit the bottom of the ground, and popped back out. The doctor said I never walked the same again. Proved him wrong, but I still get like nerve pain in it. That was happening actually 1.5 years before I was locked up. A friend of mine told me about a robbery. Folks was planning a robbery in Manhattan. Literally, I was just outside on the block, and they talking about it, and they was like they about to go case the joint. And I was like, all right, well, let me come along. Let me just walk. And part of me didn't even believe that it was really gonna do that. But I was like, I ain't got nothing to do right now. Let me just take the ride to Manhattan. And somebody went and cased the store. I didn't even go to the store. I stayed in the train station. Next thing I know, they're planning a robbery, and I'm a part of it. On that day, that Wednesday afternoon, I was in school at the time, Apex Technical School, and I literally took the day off from school. I said, I'm gonna just go along with this. We drive up into Manhattan, and we got out the car, and I get outside the car with 2 other folks who were the people that was gonna go inside the store, and I stand across the street from the store. It's no more than about 3 to 5 seconds later, shots rung out. And a lot of shots ring out. And I'm like, I don't know what's happening. So I literally just get out the store and I see where everybody walking. I just walk where everybody else is walking to get away. Because I don't really know what's happening. I don't even know who's shooting at who. As I remember looking around, I see somebody shooting at the guy that I was with. So I'm now even more confused. I'm like, what? Like, I don't know what's happening. I get home, turn on the news. I'll never forget, it was around the Subway Series time, the Mets and the Yankees. And a special report comes on Channel 4. And I remember Chuck Scarborough coming on the news and talking about 2 people were killed at a bagel shop in Manhattan and 2 other people were injured. And I see two of the guys I was with on the news arrested. I didn't have to meet for anything. I went to school the next 2 days and thinking, minding my business, and really concerned about the people that were killed, but also concerned about my friend that got locked up. Like, dag, like, you facing murder now? Like what to do? You know, early Saturday morning, I come in my elevator on the 6th floor, and as soon as I open the door, I'm a big, burly, white detective blowing smoke, cigarette smoke, and blew it in my face, and asked me, "You Marlon Peterson?" I was like, "Yeah," and he threw me against the wall. And my family were all right there, and there's cops all over here. And the cop saw me in my hand. I had some VHS tapes in my hand. He asked me what it was. I saw him what it was. He dropped it and just threw me against this wall here. And this is where I was locked up. And then they took me out. And all I remember saying, I just want to go home. I just want to go home. Obviously, I didn't go home. And that was the last time I saw the streets until I was 30 in 2009. I remember a kid telling me in a program I had started a couple years ago saying, like, guns are like sneakers, right? So, like, people having guns is like no big deal, right? It was just like, people got a gun, like, so, like, people got butter knives in their house. So when the idea for a robbery came up, yeah, robbery is serious, but I definitely think anybody I was with was capable. I mean, my logic at that time was I don't think anybody was who I was that tight with was capable of killing somebody. It sounded like when we used to come outside, you hang out, they're like, "Yo, we going to the store. You want to walk me to the store? We going to buy a pair of sneakers downtown. All right, let's go." And the store, like, we going to Case of Joint. All right, let's go. Like, you know, we're just hanging outside. It was nothing to do, and I just went along with it. It was, you know, it was obviously stupid, no question about it, and that stupidity tremendously affected and shifted people's lives. Ended people's lives.
I have the distinct pleasure of introducing a friend and a colleague, a man who is a leader in and of himself, who hit the ground running, who demonstrates tenacity, who's an intellectual giant, and he's still rather young. He hasn't even touched his peak, but yet he's already blazing the trail, and he's already set an example for many of us to follow. So without further ado, let me introduce my friend, my colleague, Brother Marlon Peterson.
There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. Now that quote is from Maya Angelou, Dr. Maya Angelou, Auntie Maya, Oprah's friend Maya. Maya means a lot to me, but I'm gonna get back to her in a second. The video that you just saw, here's the thing why I decided to open up with that. Oftentimes, those of us who have had the carceral experience are often thought of only being able to be concerned about the carceral experience. Now, I was invited to come, once again, thank you to folks at University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work, to speak about a specific topic. And I'm gonna try my best not to mention that word or those words, because those words are the things that we get caught on. And as somebody who's had the carceral experience, you know, it's important for me to always emphasize a quote from a mentor of mine who passed, Mr. Eddie Ellis, who said that there are no community problems, there are no prison problems, there are only community problems. Now that quote by Maya Angelou that I open up with, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. It's something I want to hopefully for you to remember and to continue to resonate through your head through my conversations with you all today. And be clear, we're going to talk about some of these stories, and I wanted to spend some time thinking about these stories in a nuanced way, in a way in which, because I navigate through the conundrums of the human nuance. So I don't expect you all to approach all these stories like me, but I want you all to be able to think about that quote. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you, as we speak about these stories. So a couple days ago, I found myself talking about Marcus Garvey with Wyclef Jean in his dressing room, right before they went on stage, him, Lauryn Hill, Miss Lauryn Hill, and Proswell, the Fugees, right before they went on stage and performed for the first time together in 25 years. Now, how the hell did that happen? Because a week before, I was rounding up pennies to change into paper money. So I lived this weirdly anxiety-filled, polemic, blessed, fascinating life at times. So yeah, I found myself talking to Wycliffe Jean, and right next to his room was Miss Lauryn Hill and Pride Hall. Now I didn't get to see those two up close and personal, but I got to speak to Wycliffe and speak about Marcus Garvey. Now the content of that conversation is not really important and not necessary to share with you all today. But the context of that conversation is important for me to share with you all today. Thinking about those stories again. We were having this conversation before a legendary night, but also right in the middle of when Wycliffe Jean's country people, our kinfolk, our distant relatives, were on the face of the news at the Texas border. So as I'm in this room, I'm looking at Wycliffe, and Wycliffe, he's wearing his Haitian flag fashionably around his forehead and his crown, head like a bandana. And as we're talking, and there's other people in this room, there's a few other people in the room, but these are the things I started thinking about, these stories. I started thinking about the news of the Haitian people, the disabled Haitian people, the pregnant Haitians, the miscarried Haitian girls, the newborn single-parent Haitian teens, Haitian toddlers, Haitians with diabetes, Haitians who like to cook, Haitians who are proud about Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines, Haitian deportees, Haitian aunties who are great in math, Haitian teachers, Haitian musicians, Haitian kids who like to smoke weed, Haitian savants, and Haitian boys and girls who are struggling with their sexuality and identity. All of these people were amongst those who were crossing deserts, the distance of from Brooklyn to Mexico, we could say, through on foot, through swamps, through jungle, in the middle of the summer, penniless. Those are the contexts of all those people who were crossing that, who are in that position right now, as we speak today. And I wonder about that quote again by Maya Angelou about the stories. I wonder what type of stories are we not getting? What type of stories are we not hearing? Are we hearing about the Haitian organizers who are creating ways, who are organizing the travel? Are we speaking about the folks who are creating ways in which that they can find time for the kids to play while the adults struggle to find a place to live and food to eat? I had an experience a couple of years ago, and I believe we learn best by stories. Had a couple of experiences. I was able to visit a Palestinian and Syrian, a Palestinian-Syrian refugee camp in the Kingdom of Jordan. I told you I have this interesting life, right? How did I find myself in Jordan, in the refugee camps in Palestine, in Libya, in Jordan? But I want to tell you about an experience there that stood out to me, and it's in the context of this conversation around stories, right? Because we have these stories are agonizing when you can't let them out. I was in the Syrian refugee camp in Jordan, and it's nothing more than like a makeshift air prison, open air prison. But in this open air prison, just like all prisons, they have a rec yard. They have a place where they can play. And I had access to go in the field, in the yard, where kids were playing games, and they had women who were in the place of teachers or are teachers working with the kids, and it seemed like they were just having their recreation period. And I'm getting to play with some of these young people, playing football, playing soccer, etc. But then I remember I was standing next to a young girl. She couldn't be no older than about 12, 13 years old. And she stood next to me, and what she understood of English, she asked me where I was from. And I told her from the United States. Usually I tell people I'm from Brooklyn, right? But I ain't need to get all that specific at this moment. But I told her from the United States. And I remember her looking at me with a look of disgust. And it was the first time that where I felt like, well, I'm a Black person. I'm not, I'm not a white person from the United States in terms of how people may see and think about oppression in the United States. I'm a Black person from the United States. I've been to prison. I'm from the hood. I've been through shit, right? And she didn't know all that. But what I did feel in that moment, the angst that I felt from her, was that there's a story about people from where I'm from that disgusted her in some way. And it's not a judgment on what she felt. It's a matter that she had a story of how people who come from where we come from interact with people where she's from, particularly in this refugee camp in Jordan, where she's been displaced from her family and her home. And then I remember going through this a little bit more, and in this elaborate camp, refugee camp, there's a little area where the people there have created an art gallery of sorts. Literally, they have paintings of all the things that they are thinking and imagine of their feelings. And of course, you can imagine what people who have been displaced, who are living in camps away from their home, away from the places where they knew, where they grew up, where their grandparents were, the places where they work, where they went to school. You can imagine what type of art they've created. And it's beautiful, but it's also agonizing because it's a part of the story that they have to tell. I have a friend of mine who is who's from Afghanistan, but has been displaced and now lives in Australia. And she's now in Australia. She curates a website called Narratives of Displacement. Narratives of Displacement. Her name is Durkani Ayubi. And she said this in the part of what she wrote on her website. I'm also moved to create the context which shares how what is happening in Afghanistan is not peripheral to the rest of the world. It's not peripheral to the rest of the world, but a reflection of collective structures which have been normalized to the point of invisibility. But a reflection of collective structures which have been normalized to the point of invisibility. The Afghan experience has global resonances, even if that is yet to be fully acknowledged. And in thinking about her words, I thought about that comment that in being in that room with Wyclef Jean again, and thinking about all those Haitian people who, in so many ways, we tend to think about those people in sort of isolation of the global conversation around 70 million people in this world who are displaced. 70 million people in this world are displaced, are in that category of being in refugee status at the moment, right now. And those folks at the Texas border, those Wyclef country people, our kinfolk and distant relatives are amongst those folks. And I keep going back to the stories. What stories are we missing? You see, at the outset, I showed that video again because oftentimes, as somebody who's in time, who's been time in prison, people are always curious about that experience. And I'm open to it. I wrote a whole book about it, and I'll get to it in a second. But the reason why I showed that at the outset, because I wanted people to think about in a visual manner, in just 7 to 8 minutes, to see all the stories that at the time where I filmed that maybe 5-6 years ago, all the stories that were part of that headline when I got locked up, when I was arrested, all the stories that's behind it. Now, as I said earlier, I live within the nuance of complexity when we come to these stories, meaning that not all of it is always good and not all of it is always bad, but what part of our lives is ever always good or always bad? We're always in the middle. And I think about another set of stories. So in Texas, where the University of Houston is located, you all made the news again for another thing, right? Now, no shade on Texas, maybe a little bit of shade, maybe a lot of shade, particularly around the abortion ban. Now, the reason why that comes up to me now is I think about the stories about that law is communicating to young girls who are going through, maybe not even, who are not able to have children as yet. But I think about young girls and the message that we are communicating to girls at that age who are maybe in puberty or adolescence. What messages are we sort of communicating? What stories are we telling them about themselves and their bodies? Because here's the thing about that law, right? That law says that you cannot have an abortion if it occurs. You cannot terminate a pregnancy past the 6th week, which according to them is like when cardiac activity begins. Now, this is real early. Now, I be clear, I'm just looking as a guy looking in, but I just want to just bring my perspective to it in a second. So when a person realizes that they're pregnant, it's usually because they've missed their period. That's one way. And that, from my understanding, my limited knowledge of it, is that it's about 4 weeks where you can realize where you go from cycle to cycle. So it may take, you have 2 weeks now total to figure out, one, to find out if you're pregnant, confirm it, and then deal with that finding out, and then make a decision to abort. 14 days from the time you, assuming you find out immediately. Now, the reason why that stands out to me, because I think about as a guy, how would I feel if a time was put on me in order to make a decision about my body that impacts me in my life. Now, another reason why that stands out to me, because I think about what lessons are being told to boys in this moment, when they see that there can be a law that can tell a woman what she can and cannot do with herself. What does that tell the boys who already are struggling with growing up and understanding themselves? Is that probably not telling them another story that they also can control, dictate, decide what happens to young girls or women as we get older? Here's the thing about the story, the stories that we share, but also the stories that we keep away. What are we doing in terms of who we keeping out of the equation? Who are we harming, and what's the residual effects of it? And I thought about another story, another thing that's in the news right now, right? I think about right now in New York City, Rikers Island is on the news. So if you don't know about Rikers Island is a large jail complex in New York City. It's an island off of New York City in a sense, right by, if you ever find in New York City and you look out and you're flying into LaGuardia Airport, you see Rikers Island there, right? And Rikers Island is in the news again, right? 12 people have died in custody in Rikers Island this year. It's a huge chaos there. But here's the thing about it. Just a couple years ago, we had the whole story about Khalid Browder. There was a movie made about it. Jay-Z started talking about it, all the things, right? And they made some minimal changes on the island. And here we are again years later and hearing about the deaths in this cage. And I think about, once again, how are the children now? How are the children of those people who are incarcerated on Rikers Island, how do they feel? Because here's the thing. In all the stories that I have mentioned thus far, I'm coming from a place of thinking about the children. How are the children? And the first time I ever heard that sort of question put out there in a way in which it was to test the temperature of the society that we live in was through watching a video of a scholar named Dr. Joy DeGruy. Now, she's the author of a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and she would always speak about in African culture. I don't know which part of African culture, which country, which tribe, etc., but she would speak about that they would ask in their dialect, how are the children? And that was really a greeting, like how we say, what's up, how you doing? The greeting was, how are the children? Because we can sort of think about how the children are. We have an idea of what society is like. So I think about these children in Haiti. What does that say about our society? How are the children in these refugee camps in Jordan? I think about what are we telling them? I think about the children who are seeing these laws in Texas, in your state, in Texas, determining, deciding how women should live their lives. And I think about the children who have family members on Rikers Island, because once again, we have to think about what it is we're communicating through these stories and what is it that we're letting out, not letting out. So I wrote a book, right? So one of the reasons why, as Dr. Detlef said in the introduction, is that I wrote a book called Bird Uncaged, an Abolitionist Freedom Song. Now, this book was a long time coming. In my early years of incarceration, a friend, and I'm gonna say early years, I mean within the first couple of weeks to months, people were also shocked by my being in jail, but also they were scared that I was in jail. They were worried whether or not I'd be able to make it. Would I survive? Would I be safe? So it was different questions that people would ask me, but there's three that stood out to me. The first two, they stood out to me because they seemed so silly to me at the point. The first question was, Marlon, are you going to turn Muslim? And their understanding of that question is that they had the impression that people inside who were Muslim would be protected by that community. Now, stereotypes, true or not, I had no desire to become anything, right? I was trying to figure out how to get out of prison at that point. Like, how am I going to survive this possible life sentence? Another person asked me, am I going to join a gang, right? Because the assumption that everybody that goes to prison joins gangs. And while I'm not saying that there's no truth to the fact that people join gangs in prison, everyone doesn't join a gang in prison. I had no intention of joining a gang. But there was a third question that someone asked me, or really a statement, a suggestion more than anything, more than a question. It was, Marlon, you should write a book while you're in there. Now, up until that point in my life, I was maybe 20, 21 years old. I had never written more than a 5-page book report on something or someone I barely cared about. But several years later, after that initial suggestion about writing a book, several years later, sentenced and steadily becoming a prison veteran by 24 years old, my friend Merciful, several years older than me, and my best cellmate talked to me about his book writing aspirations. Soon after, we began to go to the prison library to search for any book or magazine about the craft of writing. We became accountability partners, agreeing to write draft chapters of our books, then present to each other for feedback. We were trying to get our stories out there. 3 months later, I was transferred to another prison. That's the way prison is, the volatility of it. More than any of the prisons I had spent time in, I hated this one the most. It was the only place where I was within a step of physically retaliating against the officer. And by that time, I had become accustomed to being disrespected by officers, COs. But this time, by this time, I wasn't so accustomed and not so much in a cheek turning motion anymore. Like I said, I came close to fighting, but it didn't happen. And I'm thankful for that. But what if it did? What if I did get into that? Now, I don't think the conflict with the officer had anything to do with my being eventually transferred, but I was glad to not be in the same facility where I came close to blows with a correctional officer. I was sad that Merciful and I was separated because he was a good friend. But there was productivity to our accountability partnership. I had written about 20 pages, typewritten pages, and I don't know the ages of everyone here, but I always make these jokes. I don't know if you know what a typewriter looks like, but it's a typewriter, a Wordsmith Corona 100. And it was where I wrote probably about 20 or so pages of what would become Bird and Cage, an abolitionist freedom song. Now, the opening words of that version spoke to what 24-year-old me had to share about the world. A little bit about that story. Here's what it was. The opening words. Damn. Life is a short, depressing, gruesomely gruesome, torturous exercise. I found that quote scribbled in one of my dingy old notepads in which I had been keeping a journal over the past 6 years. That quote certainly captured my outlook on life a few years ago. Hell, who am I kidding with a few years ago? That is the way I feel today as a 20-something-year-old Black man in this world, in my world, in prison. I was 24 years old when that was my perspective on my existence. And the literary part of me wonders if gruesome is the right way to put in a sentence, but you understand that I needed the emphasis. That's how I saw my existence. And I remember, if I can recall back to that time, it was not only how I felt about my prison experience, but it's how I felt about moments in my life. Now, to be clear, my entire life wasn't gruesomely gruesome, but the parts that stood out to me, the parts that impacted me the most, just so happened to be. And it felt like a torturous exercise. And once again, as I speak about these torturous exercises that I felt, how I perceived life at 24 years old, by no means not only a child, but definitely a young person, right? I think back to those people that we spoke about before. I think about those people at the Texas border. I I think about those people in those refugee camps. I think about those people who are undergoing the government overreach with the abortion law in Texas. I think about the children who have family members in Rikers Island. Of course, I think about the people on Rikers Island or in any jail. The stories that are agonizing. Now, as I said, I wrote this book, and I wrote this story because of Maya Angelou. If you know anything about her story, she's somebody who also experienced a great deal of trauma, physical trauma, sexual trauma at a very young age. And her response to it was initially to not speak to anybody. Yes, and in that time of not speaking to anybody, I mean literally being mute, she started reading and writing, and to the point now we have Maya Angelou, right? And the thing about her is that she's somebody who Malcolm X wanted to work with her. Martin Luther King wanted to work with her. Nelson Mandela was her friend and admired her. Sonia Sanchez dedicated poems to her. Oprah reveres her. Young Amanda Gordon, the poet who spoke at the inauguration, says that Maya Angelou is one of her greatest influences. Nikki Giovanni said of her, Maya lived every moment. I've had to laugh recently that, and a couple of hours ago, let me say this correctly. This is a quote from Sonia Sanchez. Maya lived every moment. I've had to laugh recently that, and a couple of hours ago, I said, I don't know anybody, and I really don't, who has gotten as much out of life as Maya Angelou. But yet still, Maya Angelou is also the person that had that quote at the beginning, there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. How many children don't get to share, will not get to share these stories? My entry point to children, as you saw in that video at the outset, is through a prison correspondence program that was started with me and a teacher. And in that correspondence program from prison, young people were sharing with me their stories, all the things about their lives. And I still have stacks of these letters to this day in my home. And it's through those letters, through reading those letters and writing back to those children, through those children, I also realized that they had agonizing stories, that they had gruesome stories that felt like torturous exercises. And they were only about 14, 11, 12, 13, 14 at that point in time. And I thought about Maya Angelou in the sense of she was able to sort of come out of that space and live a full life. But how many of our young people don't get to live that full life? How many people on those borders won't get to live their full lives? How many people won't get to live their full lives because of government overreach or because they're being tortured inside of American prisons? Here's the thing, because I'm brought here to you today to talk about a terms that sometimes are overused. And when I say overused, I mean in the fact that we focus more on the term than we focus on the actions that the term exacts. Social justice is a term that we have, that unless you've been sleeping under a rock for the last 5 years or so, 6 years or so, social justice is on the tongues of everyone now. That term, social justice, and what does it mean, and what does it look like, and how do we do it, and how do we become better social justice warriors, and how do we make sure that social justice is a part of our organizations, and our schools, our institutions, our practice. And here's the thing. Now I have a bullet point of what social justice is, and I'm gonna get to that in a second, but I really want us to sort of think about these stories. Because socially, people are being, in the world that we live in, and particularly in the examples that I gave to you all today, people are not getting the opportunities to share these stories. And when people don't get the opportunity to share these stories, there's an agony that builds up. And how does it impact us as people who are bystanders in this moment? Because here's the thing. Social justice is fluid, not static. It is a review and rewriting of the social contract over time. It is a constant awareness of the surviving journey of other people. It is being led by the hopeful expectation of young people. It is being empathetic and discerningly self-sacrificial of those surviving differently from you. It is a radical practice of grace. It is imaginative and actionable. It is also curiously asking, gracefully listening, as I alluded to earlier, and then doing the work with vigorous intention and care. Because going back to that conversation in that dressing room and thinking about the condition and the state Wyclif's people were in, our people were in, the levels of empathy that are required to care about people who are different from us, who don't have the same experiences of us. The work that requires to hear hard stories that might intimidate us. The story of my own incarceration, right? The reason why, once again, I showed that video in the beginning, because I wanted people to sort of live within, to see within that nuance, the difficulties of understanding how somebody can be engaged in things that are harmful, but also how it is that we can figure out how to show empathy for people who are different from us, who don't come from an experience from us, particularly as people who are practitioners. I know this is the Graduate College of Social Work, and your job, your work in this particular field, like I'm understanding, is to be able to connect with people, to connect with their experience. And how do you do that if it's so different from us? Where do you find the time? How do you deal with your own sanity while dealing with the sanity of others? Here's the thing that's important for us to always keep in mind is that the work that we're doing to release those untold stories is the work of healing people. Now, I don't mean that in a figurative way. When those young people shared stories with me, when those young people wrote letters to me, they were opening me up to stories that I also had and that I needed to share. Part of the coverage of folks at the border, and I keep going back to the border because that's what's on my mind right now, and I keep thinking about the people at the border, we get a narrative of people who are only subtractive, people who only need and need and need, and we're not hearing a story of people who are additive, people who are creationists, people who are musicians and savants and soccer players and teachers and math geniuses. We're not hearing those stories. We're only hearing the story of people who are hurting, and people know people are hurting, but who only need help. And what I'm saying to you all is that we need to be able to we need to be able to embrace all the stories of people. Because ultimately what we do when we release other stories of people and we allow space for people and we allow our own uncomfortability to be deprioritized, what we allow is an opportunity for the next creation of the thing that we didn't see before. A couple of days ago, I did a television interview and it was about the politics of voting for people who are formerly incarcerated. And the first question I was asked of me was, because there's certain states where the laws are being relaxed in terms of allowing formerly incarcerated people to vote. And the interviewer asked me, what do I think is responsible for legislators now being open to allowing people who have criminal convictions to vote? And my answer was, well, the people who have been disenfranchised, these people who have not been allowed to vote, have been fighting for it. That's why legislators are opening up to it, because the people who have been impacted by it are saying, this is what we need to do, and you need to get it done. The point here is that these people like me, people had stories to say that, well, one, why are we not allowed to engage in our community in the fullest way since we're already home now? But also, we care about so many more things in our communities. Of course, we should be engaged in the politics of it. But that's only through people who have been directly impacted, the people who are going through the agony, the people who got the untold stories. It's through them sharing it. So the point I'm getting to, we go back to the earlier part about the Haitian refugees, the refugees, in the Syrian and Palestinian refugees in Jordan, the women right now who are being oppressed in Texas because of that law, and other states in the union. Also people on Rikers Island, the fact that these people have stories, not only that can save themselves and free themselves, but they can free you and can free us. That's the point I'm trying to get here, is that when we don't allow these stories, when we don't deprioritize our own comfortability for the sake of hearing these stories, for creating stories of these folks who are different from us, who are hard to who may require us to stretch a little bit our capacity to be fully human. When we don't allow it, we're harming ourselves. So are you creating that space? And once again, are you deprioritizing your comfort when it comes to the basic freedom of others? Now, it may take some time for us to get to the point where we can all get to the point of understanding these nuanced narratives. And it may take some time for us to realize that the real work, the real hope is learning more from questions than we do from answers. The answers are the stereotypes that we had. The answers are, Marlon, are you going to be Muslim? Marlon, are you going to join a gang? The question was that, hey, Marlon, maybe you can contribute to something while you're dealing with what you're dealing with at the moment. The answer is, well, maybe you can mentor kids while you're dealing with what you're dealing with at the moment. Because there's a story that I believe you have that you can share with others, that can give them permission to share their story with others, and vice versa. And we create something new. We create programs, we create opportunities. Listen, I'm here talking to you as a person who went through all the things that people who are incarcerated stereotypically may go through. I wrote a book about that. I wrote a book about all the trauma and the pain that I experienced as a young person growing up in my community. But I also wrote about the possibility. So here we go to now the last word that I have not mentioned: abolition. Abolition is about getting to the root of the thing, to understanding the nuanced narratives and the stories, to deprioritize our own comfort for the sake of allowing the freedom of others to sort of show itself and become evident. But it's also gracefully listening, curiously asking, and then vigorously doing the work to make sure that things change. To make sure that things change on those, and not only in the borders in Texas, because getting to the root of what's happening in Texas not only goes to the root of is a border problem, but it's also to the root of what's happening in our dear country of Haiti, and how countries just like the ones that we live in right now are the reason why people have been displaced from their own countries, why people have left their own countries to travel 2,000 miles up a difficult journey to here. When we think about what's happening on Rikers Island and the fact that people are dying there, or in jails in like Alabama or in Mississippi, we often just stop at, well, that's what's supposed to happen. That's what happens in jail. And I'm asking folks to think, no, let's go deeper than that. Not only why these things happen in jail, but why do we have so many people of a particular demographic ending up in these places? And what's the communities like that these people come from? And who's responsible in those communities? Let's go in deeper. Let's asking deeper questions. When I think about the folks who's happening in Texas now with the abortion ban, it makes me think about not too far from Texas, California, where they have been forcefully sterilizing women in prisons. The thing is that all these things are connected, and oftentimes we are not seeing the connections in them. And when we're not only not seeing the connections in them, but we're not listening to the stories in a way that moves us to act. Because the stories are coming from a place that may make us uncomfortable. Like I said at the beginning, Maya Angelou meant a lot to me. And the reason why she meant so much to me is because not only did she go through this tremendous trauma as a young person, and also dealing with American racism and being a woman, but somehow she was able to live such a full life. I know her to be a person who is also a writer, a poet, a calypso singer and dancer, an activist, an actor. The point I'm getting to here is this, family. I like to say family. That's, even though we are not in close proximity to each other physically, we're sharing time with each other. The other part of abolition is this. The goal for people is for all of us to be able to live full lives. And it's not an impractical thing. It's not an unrealistic thing. Because the thing is that the people who have been greatly impacted, the people who have these stories, the people who have these agonizing stories also have the possibility to live full lives, just as full as Dr. Maya Angelou did. That's the point we're getting to here. The last 3 words of my book is happiness is next. Now, I don't dictate exactly what that is, but I know that it's possible because I went through this journey. As I said before I got on this talk, I spoke to a group of students and faculty in a meet and greet. And I said that the word abolition is not mentioned in my book until the end of it. I don't want us to get hung on to the word or the word social justice. I want us to be hooked on to the action that's required of us, to the space that we need to create, to the deprioritization of comfort that we need to illustrate. It's not about the words, it's about the actions. It's about releasing the agony. It's about creating space so people no longer have untold story. Because here's the thing, the stories that are untold, or the stories that we stifle, are the stories that we need to hear the most. And usually these stories come from the children. So I'll close with that same thing that Dr. DeGroy had mentioned in one of her lectures. Because it should be just as common as any greeting as good evening, good morning, hey, how you doing? How are the children? And are they able to share their stories? Now, I know this is the conclusion of my piece of the talk. Now, I know that we're gonna have Dr. Charles Lee come on in a moderated conversation. I guess you have some more questions and answers, as well as questions from the audience. So I'm gonna wait for the camera to transition. Usually we'd be on stage and people would clap and then Dr. Lee would come on, but we're not doing that quite. Just like that. I think you're on mute.
Okay, here we are. So I'm here. So first, thank you again, and it's great to meet you, and thank you for sharing your story and your wisdom with us regarding this topic. As you know, we're primarily a community of social workers, and so I have some questions that I want to ask you during the moderated Q&A that can really help us understand, gain a deeper understanding of abolitionism and how we can effectively act and engage in this movement as social workers. And so I know the time is limited, so I'm gonna just kind of jump in with the first question. As we've explored ideas related to abolishing, carceral systems over the past year, we've seen that some of these conversations, have been very divisive, even among social workers who tend to agree with many of the issues and things related to this. And so a common critique that we've noticed of abolitionist ideas is that they're too extreme, that abolition takes things too far, and that we need, police and prisons, foster care systems, and so forth to keep people safe. Or people will acknowledge, that change is necessary, but that it can't be accomplished through reforms. And so I'm wondering, why do you believe that abolition is necessary? And related to that, why are reforms not enough?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Here's the first part, I think, is that we don't need to be in a dichotomized place of how we speak about these things. Is abolition a thing or is reform the thing, right? Abolition is saying, listen, let's try something a little different. Let's try some shit we didn't do before. That's all it is, right? That's all it is. I think we get hung. That's why, I didn't mention the word until the end of this talk, right? Until the end of it, because it's like the magic word. Abolition. You mean you're gonna close all the prisons and jails tomorrow? Listen, just even from a bureaucratic perspective, that's not possible, right? I'm not only the person that, I've been in a position of being a paper pusher as well, right? Bureaucratically, it's not possible to do it overnight. The point though is this: we want to start with the end in mind. The idea that we want to live in a community where we don't need police or we don't need prisons. I just, for the life of me, I can't understand why that's a hard thing to want to believe in, right? Isn't that what we're working towards? It's almost as if, I'll give you an example. I used to be a violence interrupter, right? And a violence interrupter is somebody who mediates, intervenes in conflicts in the community, hopefully before they happen, and try to prevent it from happening, et cetera. And I remember speaking at an event with violence interrupters and community members, and there was law enforcement there too. And I remember saying, as a violence interrupter, I hope I get put out of business. I don't want to have this job. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to have the job. Why? I think that we are limiting in what we think is possible for us, right? But also, I think we're limiting in what we think is possible for only certain groups of people, certain socioeconomic status, right? There are places that I can say I've been to, and people who I know who don't have a hard time imagining living in a community without police. I wonder what they look like. I wonder where they live, right? But I know that there are people who live in those places. And I think that when we think about Black and brown people, we associate nothing but generational criminality with that, and chaos and strife. And we think we will always need people to not only to protect them, but to keep us in place. And I'm saying that's not all that's required. Am I saying this happens tomorrow, October, or next month, or by New Year's? No, of course not. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that we got to be working with the end in mind, and what people are asking for right in this day and age when people speak about abolition or that concept or that framework is that we're asking for different results. That's all we're asking for, different results. I'm from Brooklyn. I'm from Crown Heights, Brooklyn, right? And in the 1980s, 1990s, I write about that in the book. And I can tell you this much. We've taken, for the most part, from a macro level, we've taken a heavy-handed approach to how to deal with the issues in our communities. And it's the same shit happening. That's all we are saying is try something different. Let's engage the community in a way we haven't done it before. I don't think that we need to be like, is it abolition or reform, right? I'm not religious about nothing. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that if you're not abolitionist, you're a bad person. If you're a reformer, you're a bad, I also don't live in those dichotomies. Those dichotomies is what causes wars, right? What I'm saying though is that why not try this? Give it some time, right? Policing has been, as a practice, has been in existence in the United States for almost 100 or 150 years or so, right? In a professional manner. We're trying that. We've been trying it and it's been failing a lot. What I'm saying is let's try something else, and maybe it might fail. But why not? If people of the community are asking us, people who did time, people who like me, I speak about somebody who's not only been a perpetrator, but somebody who's also been a victim of violence, sexual crime, sexual violence. I, as a survivor, am saying, why not try
it? I like how you talked about moving away from thinking about this in a dichotomized way and really thinking about how we can do something different. You touched a little bit about policing specifically. So I wanted to talk a little bit about policing because in relation to kind of the first question is just another concern that we've heard about abolition, is that if we abolish police, if we abolish prisons, then crime will be rampant and people, will be harmed in different ways. Ruth Gilmore, often, says, abolition is about presence, not absence, and that it's about building life, affirming institutions. And thinking about that quote, what does that mean to you? That abolition is presence, not absence, and what would that look like?
Yeah, I think about two things. One is, I think about one example. Just 2 weeks ago, I was having a conversation with a commanding officer of a precinct here in Brooklyn, and he was speaking about, me and him in one-on-one conversation. The commanding officer is like the head of the precinct in Brooklyn, right? Or New York City, excuse me, for that particular precinct. And one of the things that he was speaking about is the fact that I think he believes police are too relevant in the communities that they are in. He's a Black person from the community. He no longer lives in the community, but he's saying, I think we have too much of a presence in the community, right? And he's saying that some residents asked him to put police in certain places to do certain things. And he's like, I mean, he has to do it because they're asking for it, but like he is already realizing that he is too relevant in people's lives. I just want to just throw that in there for a bit. But also, okay, I lost the train of thought. What's the last half of the question?
So in thinking about that quote, abolition is about presence, not absence. What does that mean to you in terms of that abolition is presence and not absence?
Yeah. I think the presence, I gave this example. Well, I'm giving an example of being a violence interrupter, right? I think I always say we learn best by stories, right? Being a violence interrupter is that people who have been who were once engaged in harmful acts in the community, people who are involved in gangs, were involved in gangs, did time in jail, all that sort of stuff, have the ability to communicate with people who are currently engaged in all the things, right? And part of how we do that is by being a presence in the community, by building relationships with people in the community, people who we identify, who we know who getting into trouble, who want to get into trouble, right? We're not ignorant to know that there are people who want to do harm. Like, we're not ignorant to that, but we're saying that like the presence of people who are just like them can help build a relationship with them so that they can be an outlet for those people. Here's the thing about the presence part. It's important to be able not only to imagine what these communities look like without the presence of police, but also it's important for people to be honest about what the presence of police do to some of these communities, right? Like, it's an acceptance of both. If we want to be able to accept that police do provide some measure of protection for us, we also need to be honest and say police also provide a level of harm too, right? And then we make the decision, right? Listen, I'm here. I'm a speaker. I'm a writer. I do all these things. I'm not here to make anybody. I'm not here to proselytize anybody. I had a life when I used to proselytize. I used to be a Jehovah's Witness. It was my duty to go out and proselytize every Saturday and Sunday. That's not what I'm doing now, right? My job is to just lay it out for you, make people make decisions, right? We keep thinking about abolition because it scares us. And when we think about abolition, we think about chaos. I just wonder, and our book ended with this, Dr. Leah. I wonder if people back in the time of shadow slavery thought abolition would cause chaos. I wonder if people thought that. Quite possible. What you think?
I'm not gonna answer that question.
No, the reason I say that because that was a social order at the time. For one moment, separate the fact that it was racist, harmful, and all the things. It was the social order it was a forced upon, coerced, but it was a social order. It means that as a social order, it means that people who were enslaved, as well as the people who were enslaved, were conditioned to believe that is the only system that could exist. And we think about slavery in this distant, romanticized shit, but like, think about it in the present moment. We right now see these systems as the only thing that can exist, and it's always in relation to Black and brown and indigenous folks. That's the other part of it that we need to sort of uplift. It's always in relation to us. So it's in relation to us. How dare us think about communities? And I'm not saying that I said at the outset, Dr. Leah, that I live within the nuance, right? And that not everyone is going to be able to see things the way I see them, but here's the other part of it. I can't unsee the things I've seen, and I can't unexperience the thing I've experienced. And whether it's the harm from law enforcement or the tremendous possibility and promise in people who I've spent time with, and the people I've worked with on street corners. Like, I can't unsee that possibility. I can't look at them and say, we always gonna need a police officer for you. Because then what's the sense of me working with you? What's the sense of me being a person that is trying to guide you to a different experience? I need to see possibility in you. And not only in you, but I need to see possibility in these communities that we're from. It's hard work, bro. Nobody's saying nobody's saying this is easy. It's not even easy for us to understand. I'm saying that it's just possible, though.
I totally agree and hear you in terms of the work being difficult and hard. I mean, because as you mentioned, like, we're talking about histories and years and decades of these root cause issues that are showing up in present day. And you mentioned in your discussion of abolition that it's about getting at the root cause of things in many ways. And so I'm thinking about this in the context of social work. We often hear, from social workers who are working within carceral systems, who have asked, in many ways, like, well, what can we do, or how do they work towards abolition from within, systems that they work? And I'm wondering, in relation and thinking about that, is like, what are your thoughts about this, and what would you say social workers who work within these carceral systems?
Yeah, you got to think about being interrupters. I mentioned the letter writing program that we had while me and a teacher who's now as a good dear friend of mine, is Dr. Nadia Lopez, that I spoke about, like that program, the idea that you would, as a teacher, would reach into a prison and ask somebody in prison to be a part of a project to help mentor young people sounds nuts, right? And it's also probably not according to, like, it's not the curriculum. It's not the curriculum at the New York City Department of Education. It's not there. And what I'm saying is that there was an interruption there, right? This person, this teacher, this woman felt like, hey, I need to do something a little bit different to be able to get the type of outcomes I need for my people, for my young people. Now, it's risky. I'm not saying this stuff is not risky, because she could have gotten in trouble for it. I'm also not being ignorant to that either.
Right.
The question is about, like, what can you do? You didn't say what can you do without risk, right? You didn't ask that part. You didn't qualify it with that. You asked me, what can you do? Yeah. You got to find ways to be an interruption to business as usual. You got to find, and it could be subtle ways. She created a whole program. It could be about ways in which we use language in the places that we work at, right? It could be about the ways in which we uplift people in a way that's not just exploited, right? Like I'm not asking everybody to go out and lose their jobs, right? And I'm not going out asking everybody to, like, stand up in front of a prison and say, or precinct and say no more, right? There's a time and place for those things. But what I am saying, though, is that there's ways that we can create, I like to call them disruptive innovations, but there are ways in which we can subtly shift things into positions from the places we sit and stand.
Gotcha.
And people know what that is. People often know what that is. You often know how that is, what that is.
And kind of following that, kind of the narrative regarding that particular question, and kind of coming to the last question, question that I think, in thinking about, what social workers can do from within, but also this broader question about often comes up related to abolition work is how do we get there? How do we, get to what we want to see? What happens in the interim? Even if people can imagine a future without prisons and police, some don't really know, what they can do right now. And you've kind of laid out some steps in terms of being interrupters, and also thinking about, understanding nuance of narratives and deprioritizing our own comfort and so forth. And I'm wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about what are some abolitionist steps that social workers should be advocating for right now.
Yeah. I think one of the first things is ask better questions. Ask different questions of the people. If you work in an environment where you have clients, where you work with clients, participants, depending on how your organization or place of business refers to the people you work with in service, you need to ask better questions. What I mean by better questions, there was a time when how much more time we got on this? So this might take like a minute and a half on this story, but I think we learn best by these stories. I may have mentioned this at some point, but I always remember when I was working at another organization some years ago, and my capacity was not necessarily one that interacted with clients. Like, I had a high level, I was on a policy level and those sort of things. And, I got to wear a suit and tie to work, right? But in this building that I worked in, we serviced people who were coming home from jail, gave them, programming, support, job training, all the things, social services. Anyways, I'm sitting in my office one day and I hear a young person, a boy whose voice I recognized, but who was yelling at seemed like a staff member and cursing, right? And I should also mention that even though I didn't have to interact with clients necessarily, I did anyway, because I build relationships with people, right? How you doing? What's up? Like, I'm not gonna walk past you, right? Even though my job responsibility says a different thing. Anywho, I recognize his voice. I hear arguing. I go outside my office. They're in close proximity in each other's personal space. And I'm able to get his attention because he knows me, right? He knows of me. I see him around the facility. Anyway, I'm able to bring him away from that situation. Just ask him to come with me. Say, yo, come with me real quick, right? He comes with me, sits down in the office, and I just simply ask, how you feeling today, man? I just ask him, how you feeling today, right? Because he could have went off into another thing. He was close to that. And just came to find out really quick about his situation and the fact that he was pretty much asked the wrong question. He came to the program late that day, and instead of being asked a question, the person just closed the door for him and closed the door in front of him and said, you late. And that spiraled. He had a whole bunch of things happen to him that day. He was arrested the night before for sleeping on the subways. He actually came out of jail and came right to the program, but he came late, right? I just asked him a question, like, how you feeling today? And then he told me so much about his life. Social workers, I think it's important to be able to ask different questions. Ask questions you would ask your cousin or your partner, even in some cases, right? People are people, and people just need an opportunity to unleash that I just spoke about in the talk, to unleash a story, right? I think just the other thing about social workers can also do, I don't know what, depending on where you work, but know what you're capable, who and what you're capable of handling, and know if you work in a place where there are other people who are social workers or other people who are just as capable but may not have the title, who else in your vicinity can probably work with a person who you can't work with, who they may not be assigned to, and vice versa. I think also, and lastly, I think for folks who are social workers, it's very difficult but to be able to create a space of empathy for people who are not so easily to be empathetic for. And I clearly, I said this is not easy stuff, right? But that's the hard work, right? We're trying something new here. Right, we have trying to, and then be clear, when I say these things as individuals, I think systematically within an organization or a corporate culture within the organization, you work within an institution, is that like these type of conversations are not only for like the social worker, but it's a conversation for the institution, right? Not only for the, just because you happen to be that person working whose job capacity is to work with clients or participants or incarcerated, whatever. You gotta think about the institutions. If you work within a prison, then you have to ask questions of that prison facility. Yeah. And you have to bring in your institutional weight to, if you can't do it alone, if your institutional organization can also question that facility if things are going. Like, I'm not putting all the onus on one person, right? My book is about interpersonal and intrapersonal, but it's also about a look at the systemic, right? And I'm asking folks in these positions to be able to learn and practice how to do so with care, but also with rigor.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's so important, especially, as we have these binaries, even in social work, macro and micro social works, and kind of what you're saying. And what I'm hearing a lot is about the importance of us, regardless of what area we're working in, to be thinking about systems if we're at a micro, but also be thinking about individuals who are working in the macro space, because they're all interconnected in some way.
Yeah. How are the children?
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences again, and for engaging the questions that I asked. We're now going to move into our audience Q&A session. And so we'll start to display some questions that folks have asked in the chat. And the first question from Wendy Sneed is, do you have any suggestions for talking with or listening to people whose minds seem to be closed to any possibility of change or differing options?
Well, the mind, you can't open a closed mind. Particularly if people are set in their ways. I'm asking you to do. You can't force anything on people. Only thing you do is model and practice it. Like, even in the way folks, as a person who speaks about these issues, my intention is not to make people change. My goal is not to change your mind. My goal is to tell you what's happening and look at it from a very honest and brutal way, right? This book, even in the book that I wrote, I'm just telling you exactly these are the things that are happening. And these are how people are responding to some of these things. Not everybody responds to things the way I responded to them, but I'm sure I'm not the only person who responded to life the way I have. So, you have to be able, I think it's important for us to be able to do our own personal interrogation, to constantly be opening our own minds and challenging ourselves. And one thing that I said about abolition, I didn't say before, is that it's a deep process of questioning ourselves on how we stand on certain issues as they happen in real time. As a person who believes in abolitionist politics, don't think that I don't watch the news sometimes and see about a thing that happens harmful on news and be like, I want that person to go to jail. I want that person, like, don't think that I'm some higher elevation that I don't also have that default. What I've worked on, however, is that I question more. I allow that initial reaction to come, and then I ask other types of questions. That's the difference, asking other types of questions. So for you who work with other people, maybe you can try asking different types of questions of them, but don't have expectations that people are going to automatically believe this just because you are. And be quite frankly, people don't have to. That's the other part. People don't have to. People don't have to. I don't want to, we get into this place when we have a certain theory that we believe in or practice that we believe that everybody got to believe in it. That's what, not to knock any sort of religion, but that is sort of like what religion by default has done in some ways, and at least in the past, historically. Believe in this. If you don't believe in this, you're wrong. That's not the point I'm getting. I don't want people to walk away saying that if you don't believe in abolition, you're wrong. I'm saying try it out.
Cool. Thank you. So we'll go on to our next question.
Thank you, Wendy, for that.
Okay, so the next question is, you talked about seeing your existence as gruesomely gruesome as a 24-year-old. How would you see your existence today?
Is that alliteration between an adjective and an adverb? Is that, I don't know if that's, anyway, it might not even be right. All right, let me get into the weeds. At the time.
It makes sense to me.
How do you feel about your existence today? I'm blessed. I'm 41 now, right? I'm here. I'm still here. I'm here, and I've had, wonderful experiences. I have wonderful people in my life. Life is always up and down, but I feel I'm thankful. I'm thankful about my existence today. I think my existence has been, for what it's worth, I think my existence to this point has been better for the people around me than not. You know what I mean? So I'm thankful for the existence that I get to have every day. Yeah, it was different back then, though.
Anything specific that makes you grateful for your existence today?
Listen, I don't take for granted the fact that people are spending their evening with me virtually, listen to me talk. I thank people for that. And so just in being a moment of gratitude, like, this is not a small thing. I don't want people to think, well, you talk all the time and it's no big deal. Like, I'm grateful for this, that people are willing to engage with me and listen to some of the things I have to say or opine about. Because I think that's a sort of like a illustration of the life I've created. It took a lot of work I've created for myself thus far, right? I think, like, I didn't just pop up here. I belong here, right? And I belong here, and I know I belong here because of the life I've decided to lead, despite all the gruesomely gruesomeness, right? And there's so many other specifics I can speak about, but I just want to sort of like be very basic at the moment.
Yeah.
I'm thankful to be here. At my book signing and my book launch, I had a small little book launch when it first came out in April. And, one of the things that someone said, the moderator, who was also that teacher, Nadia Lopez, was the moderator at the book launch. She said, like, you survived. Like, you survived it. And I, in so many ways, it might be basic, but I've survived and I've thrived a little bit. I've been able to, not only have I been able to, like, I spoke about the refugee camp in Jordan, but I also got to bathe in the Dead Sea in Jordan. Like, that to me is, that Dead Sea's in the Bible. You know what I'm saying? That's I think Moses was around there. But like, I got to bathe in that. That's a blessing for me. That wasn't in the cards. I'm thankful for that.
Gotcha. So we're going to move to our last audience question. So we'll wait for it to display on the screen in just a second. And then we'll kind of wrap up with Dean That Live.
You see, I stood up the whole time. I wanted
to. I need to stand up myself. Yeah. So the last question is, if you could redesign the ideal response to the situation that led to your incarceration, what would it look like? Instead of prison, what would be a better response for yourself, as well as those who were more directly involved in the violence?
Yeah. Good. I mean, I don't know if I've ever, in my life, I don't think anybody has ever asked me this question, and definitely not in this sort of detailed way. If you could design the ideal response. So what I think, right? I think about not only, it's hard to answer that question just like in the moment of like the thing that happened, like this thing happened in a moment. I would think about all the missed responses to the things that happened to me prior to, right? All the missed things, whether it be in the educational system, other, people in my life, the things that people missed, right? Or me speaking about some of the things that happened to me. Come think about before before the crime happened, right? Now, in terms of, if you want to go straight to the crime and as it happened, it's something I always wanted to think about, and this is a larger issue. And the person I think about now is a gentleman right now who's dealing with it. His name is Lakeith Smith. Lakeith Smith. I want people to like Google that person. Lakeith Smith, I believe his name is, right? And he's like serving about 50 or 60 years now under the same thing that I was incarcerated for, which is the felony murder rule. Right, which means that in the pursuit of a felony, in this case, a felony was a robbery, a homicide did happen, even though I didn't commit the homicide. But because I was alone, I knew I was aware of a felony, which was the robbery was about to happen. I'm also responsible for the homicide. I think that, and that's what got me initially facing a life sentence. And there are two other people who still, serving pretty much life sentences. I would want to redesign. I think we should rethink the felony murder statute in this country. The felony murder statute in this country captures a lot of people, right? And not only captures them, but captures them for the rest of their lives. If the incident I was a part of and the crime I was a part of happened in Alabama, per se, I would probably have gotten the death penalty. And I'm not saying that with any hyperbole. Right, I'm not saying hyperbole at all. When I was initially arrested, New York State had the death penalty, and I was initially charged with first-degree murder, which the consequence would be the death penalty. So I'm not saying that in hyperbole, right? So I will rethink the felony murder rule, but also outside of from a legal perspective, if there was a social worker who sat down with me before I was sentenced as part of the probation report, and we had a good time, we had a great conversation. And that woman, I don't remember her name, it's so long ago, but was kept, by the end of it, was questioned like, geez, I don't think that prison is what you need. Now, she had she in her recommendation, she didn't say that exactly, but she said something to the like of it, so much so that the prosecutor at my sentencing censured her, the probation officer, the person who did the report, because of how favorable it was to me, right? So what I'm saying though is that I think at that time I was 19. I was 3 months away from graduating from Apex Technical School to be an HVAC technician. It was the first time I'd ever been in any real contact with the law. There are many other responses that could have happened that didn't have to result in incarceration. Now, but incarceration is all that we knew, and it's all that we have and had. And I often say that I'm in no position. I'm in no position to speak about what should have happened to me, because that's just not where I went. But I am in a position to speak about what shouldn't happen to other people. And I think about Lakeith Smith. I want folks to look him up, look up that case, and get involved with it if possible, because I think there's an opportunity now to sort of redesign the response to his current situation, which is very similar to mine. So instead of living in the past, let's live in the present.
Marlon, I want to thank you again just for being here today, and again for sharing your story, sharing your wisdom with us, and answering these questions. This has been very enlightening. And again, good luck to you in your endeavors as you move forward in your work in abolition, and Want to welcome Dean Detlef back to help us out for the session. But thank you again, and nice to meet you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I really appreciate you being our moderator this evening, and thank you again, Marlon, for being with us tonight. You know, you were on our campus a couple of years ago. We were very grateful to have you on campus and to get to know you then, and really grateful for you to be back and presenting to our students again. For everyone watching at home, I hope you'll share your thoughts about today's event on your social media channels. Continue to engage with us using our hashtag #SocialJusticeUH. And at the Graduate College of Social Work, we're committed to continuing these conversations. So I hope all of you will stay connected to us on our social media channels, our website, our electronic newsletter. And if you're interested in learning more, all of the events from last year's Eyes on Abolition series are all available on our website. And lastly, I hope you will save the date and plan to join us on November 10th for our annual Social Justice Solutions event. This year, we're very excited to welcome Derica Purnell, author of the new book to be released next week, Becoming Abolitionists, Police, Protests, and the Pursuit of Freedom. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you'll continue to share your thoughts, and I hope to see you all again very soon.